He rode out to rescue her, but she ended up healing his grief. Some cowboys don't save the girl, they save themselves. The cabin sat at the edge of the world, or at least it felt that way. Tucked behind a crooked line of pine trees and backed by hills that rolled on without apology, it had once been meant for a family, built by hand, stone by stone, with the kind of care a man only gives when he's building for someone else. But now, years after the fever came and took everything it wasn't supposed to, it was just a shelter, not a home. Nolan Cassidy lived there with his horse, a few hens that refused to lay, and silence thick enough to press into your ribs. He didn't speak to folks unless he had to, didn't visit the town church, didn't write letters. Some men grieved loud. Nolan let grief hang around his shoulders like an old coat he couldn't take off. Then came the whispers. A girl, they said, thin as a pine switch, moving through the woods near the North Creek, kept to herself, didn't speak, never stayed in the same place twice, like a deer half expecting the shot. He told himself it wasn't his business, told himself plenty of things he always had. But one evening, as he stood in the barn brushing down his horse, he remembered the way his little girl used to turn her head before she cried. That same slow glance, like she didn't want to bother the world with her pain, and he couldn't get the image out of his mind. He didn't set out to find the girl, but he didn't avoid the ridge path anymore, either, because some men ride out thinking they're going to rescue someone, but what they find is a mirror, cracked in all the same places. And sometimes, when you've forgotten how to live, watching someone else try to survive is enough to pull you back into your own skin. That's how this story begins. Not with a hero, not with a damsel, but with two quiet people, each carrying too much silence, each pretending they preferred it that way, until one of them finally looked up. She was running but never asked to be saved. The wind still carried a winter edge that spring morning when Nolan first saw the footprints. Light, almost apologetic, pressed into the muddy trail just east of the fence line. Too small for a man, too soft for boots hardened by ranch life. And wrong, somehow wrong for this stretch of quiet land where nothing moved that wasn't supposed to. Nolan Cassidy wasn't one to pry. He'd lived alone for long enough to know the value of silence, of staying on your own side of the fence. But something about the prints tugged at him, not fear, not suspicion, just a quiet flicker of interest, the kind that came when something shifted in a life long frozen. A few days earlier, someone at the general store had mumbled about a girl living near the northern woods. Thin one, they'd said, moves like she's afraid of her own shadow. Folks say she camps by the creek, never speaks, always looking over her shoulder. Nolan hadn't responded. But now, here were the signs. And in that moment, he didn't feel like walking past. The next morning, he went out early and followed the same trail, past the split elm, along the ridge. That's when he saw her. She was crouched beside a collapsed section of fence, sleeves rolled to her elbows, tying splintered beams with fraying rope. No gloves, no tools. Her hands were raw and red, knuckles split from the cold. She worked quietly, with the kind of patience that came from doing things the hard way, not out of pride, but because no one had ever offered another option. She didn't look up when he approached, didn't flinch, just acknowledged him with the smallest nod, like she'd seen him coming a long time ago and decided not to run. "This fence won't stop wolves," Nolan said, standing a few yards away. "I'm not afraid of wolves," she replied, still focused on the rope in her hands. Her voice was steady, worn in, not sharp, not defensive, just used to not being heard. He left without saying more, but the next morning he returned, set down a bundle of firewood and a short hunting knife near the same fence post, then turned and left. When he came back the next day, the knife was gone. The wood remained untouched. For the next week, they danced like that. No names, no questions. He'd leave something behind: jerky, a patched wool scarf, a coil of clean rope. She'd respond with silence, sometimes with a fresh bundle of kindling stacked near his gate. Once, he found a pine cone carefully wrapped in linen-dried rosemary tucked inside. No message, just present. Then, on a dusk that looked more like smoke than light, Nolan came upon her sitting by the creek, her knees drawn to her chest, hair tucked under a wide-brim hat that had seen too many seasons. She didn't startle when he stepped into view, just tilted her chin slightly, like acknowledging an old neighbor. They didn't speak at first. He sat a few feet away, knees creaking as he lowered himself to the dirt. The creek babbled without purpose between them. That kind of silence could swallow you whole or heal you, depending on how you carried your past. Eventually, he asked, "Why here?" She didn't answer right away. She watched the water move for a long time before whispering, "Because no one here knows my name. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, not from emotion but from disuse, and Nolan understood. He understood in the way a man does after years of carrying grief so quietly that it became part of his breath. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask what she'd done. He only nodded and said, "That's reason enough." Over the following days, he didn't visit every morning, but when he did, she was nearby, always working, mending traps, boiling water, tending a garden that shouldn't have grown anything in this soil. She moved like someone rebuilding something she didn't dare call a life. People in town started talking. They always do. Rumors floated through the saloon and the feed store. Some said she was on the run. Others claimed she'd killed a man. But Nolan never paid those words much mind. He had seen the way she fixed a broken fence with torn-up sleeves, and the way she stared at the horizon like it might someday let her go. He didn't think she needed saving. He didn't think he was her rescuer. He just thought if someone's willing to stay in the kind of silence you've lived in for years, maybe you leave a piece of bread, maybe a knife, maybe your name, but not all at once. And if you're lucky, maybe they stay. Because not everyone who runs wants to be found. Some just need a place where they don't have to explain why they're still breathing. A place where grief isn't questioned, and names aren't currency. Just presence, just space, just enough quiet to be human again. That's what Nolan was learning. Not all wounds bleed. Some sit in the corners of a girl's silence and wait for someone to notice without asking. And not everyone who's alone is broken. Some are just rebuilding with no audience. He didn't need to fix her. She didn't ask to be fixed. And that was where the healing began. A cowboy with grief and a girl who listened. The storm came in slow that evening, the kind that didn't rush but announced itself in the shifting wind, the way pine needles twitched like they were whispering secrets before the rain. Nolan had been checking the northern fence line again, not for cattle. He hadn't kept any in years, but out of habit, maybe out of an old ache that still told him to move when the sky darkened. That's when he saw the smoke, thin, almost reluctant, rising from the base of the ridge where the creek bent west. It was the kind of smoke that said someone had tried hard to make it invisible, but failed. And he knew, without guessing, that it was her. He didn't go straight to her, just found a dry patch under a leaning fir, tied his horse to a root knot, and waited. The rain started in slow taps, like a hesitant knock on old wood. Then it thickened, soaked through his coat, and slid into the collar of his shirt like a memory he couldn't shake. When he finally stepped into the clearing, she was crouched under a makeshift lean-to, coaxing a flame beneath a dented tin pot. She didn't look up. "I brought coffee," he said. She didn't answer, but she moved the pot slightly, making room. He took it as an invitation. They didn't speak much. Shared the quiet between bites of burnt bread and bitter beans, rain pattering steady over the tarp above their heads. He handed her the coffee without ceremony. She drank like someone who hadn't had warmth in days, maybe longer. It wasn't the kind of meal anyone would remember for the food, but it had weight. Not in what was said, but what wasn't. After a while, Nolan leaned back against a mossy log and stared into the fire. His voice came quiet, like a man not sure if he was talking to her or just saying something out loud for the first time in years. She was 29 when the fever took her. My wife, Clara, had the softest voice, like creek water in early spring. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. She kept her hands wrapped around the tin cup and listened. She made blueberry biscuits on Sundays, even when flour was low. She'd hum while she worked, never said a word, just hummed like the house was alive. A long pause. Then the fever came, and I thought we've been through worse. We've survived winters, droughts. But that fever, it didn't take time. Took her by morning. My little girl followed 2 days later. He wiped a sleeve across his face, not for tears but for rain. Or maybe both. They were the only voices in the house. After they left, it went quiet. I tried talking, just to hear something, but the words felt like trespassers. He stopped then, not because he'd finished, but because something caught in his throat, the kind of silence that wasn't meant to be filled. For a long moment, the fire was the only thing that moved. Then she spoke, barely a whisper. "I used to talk to the trees," she said, "when no one else would listen. Then one day, I stopped, and they didn't seem to mind." He turned to her. She was still holding the cup, but now her hands shook a little, just enough to see. He asked, softly, "Why are you still here then?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I forgot how to leave." And Nolan felt something shift, not in her, but in him. He'd carried grief like it was his job, built fences around it, let it define the way he woke, the way he didn't speak, the way he looked at a sky and never said thank you. And yet here was this stranger, this girl with too much silence and too few words, sitting beside him in the rain, not trying to fix it, not telling him to move on, just sitting. It was the first time in years he didn't feel like he had to explain the heaviness in his chest. The first time he thought maybe he wasn't broken, just tired of carrying it alone. She didn't offer advice. She didn't promise things would get better. She didn't tell him to be strong. She simply stayed. And in that storm-soaked clearing, where grief had settled into the bones of two people who never meant to meet, something else quietly took root. Some pain doesn't need answers. Some wounds don't need words. Sometimes, all a person needs is someone who stays long enough to prove they're not alone in it. And that's what she gave him. Not rescue, not redemption, just presence. And sometimes that's more than enough. She didn't need protection, just permission to stay human. The nights in the highlands turned colder as summer faded. Even the crickets quieted earlier, as if the land itself knew how to keep secrets. Nolan had grown used to silence, had worn it like an old coat, but since she started showing up near the fence line, silence had taken on a different tone. Not empty, but expectant, like two people standing at opposite ends of a long bridge, unsure who should step first. She never stayed too long, never asked for shelter, food, or safety. Just passed through his land like mist. But that night, something was different. The wind had shifted. The creek ran a little faster, muddy from upstream. He saw her silhouette on the ridge long before she reached the porch, shoulders hunched, gait uneven. It wasn't caution, it was exhaustion. He opened the door before she knocked. She stood there dripping, soaked to the bone, a streak of dried blood along her sleeve, not her own, by the look of it. Still, she didn't ask to come in, didn't say a word. He stepped aside. She walked past him and sat near the cold stove, hands tucked under her arms, jaw tight with something old, something practiced. He lit the fire without speaking. When the room warmed, she finally spoke. "Do you ever do the right thing and regret it every day after?" Nolan didn't answer right away. He poured her a cup of weak coffee, then sat across from her, waiting. She stared at the flames for a long time before continuing. "There was a boy, not much older than 19, wounded, chained, covered in bruises so thick I couldn't see his skin. They said he was a traitor, said he sold maps to the enemy. I was assigned to clean him up before interrogation." Her voice was flat, but her hands trembled slightly. "He didn't beg, didn't plead, just looked at me and asked if I could tighten the bandage on his ribs, said breathing hurt less that way. Ugh." That night, I left the door unlocked, left food, water, told him where to run. I thought I was saving someone, but I was just painting a target on myself. She paused. "They never proved it was me, but they knew. Someone always knows." Nolan listened, really listened. "They started watching me, following, Not openly, just enough to remind me I'd stepped outside the line. I left. I've been running ever since. The fire popped softly, the room shrinking around their shared silence. I wasn't brave, she said finally. I wasn't trying to make a stand. I just couldn't watch someone die when I had a key in my hand. And Nolan, for the first time, understood why she never asked for help, why she didn't flinch, but also didn't trust. She hadn't lived a life of guilt, she'd lived one of consequence, the kind that punishes mercy and chases kindness into the wood. He stood, walked to the mantel, and reached for the revolver that had sat there for years, loaded, untouched, a quiet promise to any future danger. He opened the cylinder, emptied the rounds into his hand, and placed the gun in a drawer near the hearth. Closed it, locked it. Then he said, I don't want anyone feeling afraid in this house, especially not someone who chose to be human when it cost her everything. She didn't thank him, didn't cry, just exhaled for the first time that night and leaned back against the log wall, eyes half closed, as if finally allowed to rest. The next morning, she was gone. Left a pile of kindling near the porch, bundled in burlap. But Nolan noticed something small tucked between the sticks, a torn scrap of fabric with a stitched emblem military ripped clean from a uniform, folded like a memory, left like a truth. He stared at it for a long time. She hadn't needed his protection. She hadn't asked to be believed. All she needed was space to tell the truth aloud, without being chased from it. And in a world that punishes mercy, maybe the greatest act of kindness is simply to say, you did right. I see you. You can stay. Sometimes the world doesn't come after you with fire and fury. Sometimes it just waits until your kindness costs too much to carry. And sometimes you keep carrying it anyway. Because some people don't need fences or guns or someone to ride in and save the day. They just need a place where they're allowed to remain soft, where compassion isn't a crime, where being human isn't punished with exile. That night, Nolan didn't rescue her. She didn't surrender. But something shifted, subtle but permanent. She had finally stopped running, not because she felt safe, but because, for once, she didn't have to explain why she ran in the first place. A stranger with a garden in a land where nothing grew. The wind was beginning to turn warm again. Not summer yet, but no longer winter, just that in-between hush when the land starts testing itself for softness. The kind of quiet that makes a man notice things he'd long stopped paying attention to, like the way the ground gave off a different smell in the morning, or how, out near the back shed, something green had started pushing through the earth. At first, Nolan thought it was a weed, or maybe a stubborn patch of winter clover. But a few days later, there were lines, rows, actually neat in their crookedness. Not wild, not accidental, planted. He stood there for a long while, watching from the shade of the barn. There was no sound but the buzz of flies and the far-off shuffle of cattle down in the valley. Then she appeared. She was kneeling, her back to him, sleeves rolled up, fingers covered in black soil. No tools, just her hands. She dug, patted, smoothed, then did it again and again. He didn't call out, just watched as she worked, patient and steady, like she'd been doing this her whole life. But he knew she hadn't. He knew something else was happening here. The next morning, he walked out to find a small mound of ash beside the rows. Not fire ash cooked down wood, mixed with bits of eggshell and fish bones. Compost, rough, homemade, and desperate. She was feeding the ground, asking it to give her something back. It didn't make sense. The soil out here was poor, dry, half rock. Most ranchers gave up trying to plant anything but fence posts. Yet here she was, planting beans. He finally spoke that evening. Came out to where she was crouched under the last light of day, sweat darkening the back of her shirt, the smell of sunburn and ash clinging to her skin. Why here? He asked. Why try to grow something in this dirt? She didn't look up, just pressed another seed into the shallow furrow and said, I lost everything. And this is how I fight back. There was no pride in her voice, no triumph. Just the kind of quiet resolve that comes from someone who's got nothing left to prove and everything left to reclaim. Nolan didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The next day, he sharpened the old hand spade that had been rusting under the porch and left it near the garden with a new coil of twine. No note, no explanation. The day after that, she used them. Weeks passed. Rain came and went. The rows multiplied. Lettuce, squash, even tomatoes that should have never taken root in that soil. She made trellises from stripped branches, tied together with rags and stubbornness. Every day, something new pushed up from the ground like it had been waiting for permission. Sometimes Nolan helped. Sometimes he just watched. And sometimes they worked side by side without a word between them. She never asked him to stay. He never asked her to go. One morning, he found a circle of smooth stones arranged near the tomato patch, a small jar in the center filled with water and a single white feather. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. But that afternoon, she hummed while she worked. It wasn't a happy song, but it was a song. That night, over cornbread and weak stew, she said, "In the city, I had a balcony, just big enough for a single planter. I tried to grow thyme once, but the pigeons ate it." Nolan chuckled. "I tried corn once. The wind took it." She smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "Funny how we both failed at growing things. Guess it's about trying again," he said. "Or planting in better soil." He looked at her hands, calloused, nicked, stained, and thought, sometimes the soil isn't what changes. Sometimes the hands do. The first time the beans flowered, she stood there at dawn, fingers touching the blossoms like they were glass. "You did this," Nolan said quietly. "No," she whispered. "The earth forgave me." And somehow, he understood. Some people say hope looks like speeches and second chances. But sometimes it looks like a bent back, dirty hands, and one stubborn row of beans in impossible soil. Because planting is a form of rebellion, a way of saying, "I still believe in tomorrow, even if today gave me every reason not to." She didn't wear her pain like armor. She turned it into mulch. And in doing so, she taught him that healing isn't always about talking. Sometimes it's just about digging into hard ground, digging into yourself, and trusting that something will grow. He gave her shelter, she gave him season. It started with a lantern, a soft amber glow from the window that hadn't been lit in years. Nolan noticed it one evening on his way back from checking the south pasture. The sun had just dropped below the horizon, and the porch still smelled faintly of fresh-cut pine from the repairs he'd done earlier that month. But the light inside it was new, not blinding, not bold, just steady. He didn't remember leaving it on. When he stepped inside, he found a loaf of cornbread wrapped in linen sitting on the table, still warm. A wooden spoon rested beside it. The fire in the hearth hadn't been started by him, but it was crackling softly. No note, no voice, just presence. That night, he slept without waking up once. First time in 6 winters. As the weeks passed, small things began to shift around the house. A patched shirt hung beside the door. An extra mug appeared on the shelf. A strip of dried lavender tied above the stove. None of it was planned. None of it was spoken about. But by the time spring tilted into summer, the house no longer felt like a monument to something lost. It felt like it was being lived in. They moved through it like old ghosts learning to be human again. Some days, they worked together, fixing the roof, digging a new line for water runoff, mending fence rails. Other days, they kept their distance. But even then, there was rhythm. He'd leave tools out. She'd return them clean. She'd stack firewood. He'd cover it with tarp before the rain. There was no declaration, no pact, no promise. But there was habit. In late July, she brought home a book from town, a novel with the cover torn, pages swollen from old rain. That evening, he found her sitting on the porch swing, reading it aloud in a quiet voice that barely carried past the railing. He sat beside her and didn't say a word. A week later, they started reading every night, 1 page each, back and forth. No matter how tired they were, no matter if the story made sense, because it wasn't the story that mattered. Autumn came without announcement. The air turned sharp, and the leaves changed like they'd always been meant to. They hung dried herbs in the pantry, smoked fish, salted what little meat they could afford. He built a new chicken coop. She taught him how to make vinegar from old apple skin. One afternoon, they sat on the porch shelling beans. He glanced at her hands strong, marked by labor, and said, almost without meaning to, I built this house for Clara. My wife. She picked the stone for the fireplace. She didn't look up. She passed before we could finish it. I stopped working on it after that. Let the roof go. Let the walls lean. There was silence, not out of discomfort, but respect. Then she said, if you don't keep living in it, a house becomes a tomb. He didn't reply, just nodded and passed her another handful of beans. Winter settled in slow, like an old friend you didn't expect to see again. Snow came early, blanketing the pasture in white silence. The world felt muffled. Inside the house, though, there was life. Bread baking. A dog now asleep near the hearth, one she found shivering by the barn and named Hollow. New curtains. A pine tree cut from the ridge, standing awkward and proud in the corner, strung with dried orange slices and bits of twine. They weren't a couple. They weren't lovers. There were no names for what they were, just two people learning how to stay. On the coldest night of the year, he woke to find her gone. Panicked, he threw on his coat, stepped out into the snow, heart pounding like it had when the fever took Clara. But then he saw her standing barefoot in the garden, now covered in ice. She was holding a candle. When he reached her, she whispered, today's the day I left the city. 1 year. He didn't speak. She bent down, placed the candle in the snow, and said, I just wanted something to grow here. He looked at the dark garden, at the dead stalks and frost-covered vines, and said, it did. Some things don't need to be said to be true. Some homes aren't built from wood, but from choosing to stay. And some seasons don't change with the calendar. They change when two people decide not to leave. Nolan hadn't asked her to move in. She hadn't asked if she could. But over time, their footsteps wore the same path through the floorboard. Their shadows fell across the same porch. And their mornings began with the same silence. Shared, not lonely. He had given her shelter. She had given him time. And somewhere in between, they gave each other back a life. There was no ending, but something was growing. The man at the feed store was just passing through. One of those drifters with worn boots and a hat too clean for real work, the kind who asked more questions than he needed to. Folks didn't pay him much attention, most didn't answer either. But when he mentioned the cowboy who lives near the ridge, ears perked. Is it true? He asked, leaning on the counter like the words carried no weight. He took in a girl once? Said she was on the run. No one gave him a straight answer. Later that week, the same man ended up at Nolan's gate, dust on his coat, curiosity in his eyes. The cabin stood quiet, chimney trailing a thin line of smoke into the sky. The dog, old now, but still sharp, watched from the steps without barking. Nolan opened the door before the man knocked. Apologies, the visitor said. Didn't mean to interrupt, just heard a story and wanted to see if there was any truth to it. Nolan raised an eyebrow, said nothing. They say you rescued a woman once, gave her shelter, that she was wanted in 3 counties. There was a pause just long enough to feel like the moment was choosing its word. Then Nolan smiled, slow and quiet. You heard it wrong, he said. I didn't save her. She saved me. The visitor waited, expecting more, some tale, some confirmation. But Nolan didn't elaborate. He just leaned on the porch rail, looking out across the field where green had begun to creep back into the earth after the thaw. Behind him, the door creaked open, and the faint smell of bread baking drifted out. A woman's voice, calm, unhurried, called out about tea on the stove. Nolan turned back and nodded toward the man. You're welcome to stay for supper, but if you're looking for a story with a clean ending, you won't find one here. He never told anyone how long she'd stayed, never gave her name, didn't explain why the shutters were painted now, or why there were new books on the shelf, or how the rocking chair on the porch had been fixed with a piece of floral fabric wrapped around the backrest like a ribbon of memory. But folks noticed. They noticed the smoke curling steady from the chimney each morning, not frantic, not fading, just consistent. They noticed the rows of beans replanted every spring, even when frost hit too early. The sound of humming from the garden, two mugs drying on the sill, boots lined side by side. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. Enough to know something had taken root out there. Something that didn't need headlines or declarations or endings to be real. One neighbor, old and nearly blind, said it best one afternoon as he leaned on his cane and stared toward the ridge. "I don't know what they are, those two, but I know the house feels different now, warmer, like it's not waiting for ghosts anymore. Some stories don't end. They grow, like vines around the porch post, like bread rising slow in a quiet kitchen, like footsteps wearing soft grooves into wooden floor. No one needs to understand it. No one needs to write it down. Sometimes, a life simply changes shape without asking permission, without explanation. And for those who stop chasing answers long enough to look, they'll see it. Not a rescue, not a miracle, not a love story, not really. Just two people, still here, still choosing, still building something that doesn't need a name, because it has roots. Some wounds don't heal, they become soil. Every winter, the cabin on the ridge glows warm against the snow. It's not the brightest light, not the kind that draws attention, but it's steady golden behind old curtains, flickering like a heartbeat that forgot how to stop. Folks down in the valley say the house feels alive again, not noisy, not busy, just present. No one talks much about who lives there now. They know, of course. They've seen the cowboy older, a little slower riding into town every month or so. And they've glimpsed her too, the woman with steady eyes and sleeves always rolled up, buying coffee, sugar, seed packets, never saying more than she needs to. No one asks where she came from anymore. No one asks what she's running from. Because something about that house tells you, whatever happened before, it stays in the trees now. It's not erased, just folded into the land, like rainwater into dry ground. There's a garden that never dies completely, even through the frost. There's a dog with gray around its muzzle who still runs like a pup in spring. And there are two mugs on the porch railing, side by side every morning. Not everything was fixed. Not every hurt was named. But in the silence they shared season after season, they grew something else. Acceptance. Not of who they used to be, but of who they could still become. And when a traveler once asked Nolan about the woman who lived with him what her story was, what her name had been, he just smiled and said, "She chose not to bring her name when she started living again." Because some wounds don't close up neatly. They don't fade or vanish. They don't heal in the way people expect. But they soften, they break open, and if you let them, they become the very soil where something gentler can take root. And that, in the end, is more than enough. Some stories don't end with a kiss, a goodbye, or a ride into the sunset. This one ends with something quieter, two people choosing to stay, not because they had to, but because they finally could. He thought he was saving her, but it was her quiet strength, her way of simply being, that showed him how to live again. The lesson? Healing doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like planting beans in bad soil and staying long enough to see them bloom. Tell us in the comment, which part of the story hit you the hardest? What lesson or feeling will you carry with you? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that silence can hold love too, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales like this one. And as this story fades out, I'll leave you with this. What would grow in your life if someone simply stayed?